Bob, another problem passage for free gracers might be John chapter 2, verses 23 to 25, which says this: "Now when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover, during the feast, many believed in his name when they saw the signs which he did. But Jesus did not commit himself to them because he knew all men." Doesn't this mean there's such a thing as a substandard faith?
Well, a lot of people call this sign faith or miracle faith, and they say it's less than saving faith. And the reason they point that out is the Greek verb pisteuo is used in two different ways in verses 23 and 24, but it's used back to back. In verse 23, it says, "Now when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover during the feast, many believed in his name." That's pisteuo. When they saw the signs which he did. So they call it sign faith because the miracles came from the signs which he did at the feast of Passover. But verse 24 says, "But Jesus did not commit himself to them." That's also the verb pisteuo, used in the sense of Jesus didn't entrust himself to them, or we could say commit himself to them, because he knew all men and had no need for anyone to testify of man, for he knew what was in man. And people say, see, he knew they didn't really believe. Well, there are multiple problems with this, and let me just tick them off one at a time. The first problem is that it's not they themselves that say they believe in his name. It's John who tells us they believed in his name. In verse 23, John says, "Many believed in his name." And in John chapter 1 and verse 12, John says, "But as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, to those who believe in his name." Same exact Greek expression. Believing in his name, John 1:12. Believing in his name, John 2:23. According to John 1:12, anyone who believes in his name is a child of God and is born of God, John 1:13. Therefore, to somehow say these people don't really believe when John says they really believe and they believe the right thing in his name, it's ridiculous. Secondly, to say that the problem here is this is sign faith contradicts the purpose statement of John's gospel, John 20, 30, and 31. Many other signs Jesus performed in the presence of his disciples. But these signs have been written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing that you may have life in his name. The whole purpose in the signs was to lead people to faith. So how could faith in him because of his signs be substandard? That's ridiculous. It contradicts the whole purpose of John's gospel. The third thing is, when it said Jesus didn't entrust himself to them, using the Greek word pisteuo, that doesn't in any way suggest they weren't born again. The idea is that Jesus is going to only entrust further information to people who are committed to confessing him. And as I'm going to show you in a minute, there's good evidence to believe that the problem with these people was not that they didn't believe. The problem was they were unwilling at this point to ruffle the feathers of the Pharisees and to be kicked out of the synagogues by confessing their newfound faith in Jesus. In fact, we're told in John 12:43 that even many of the rulers believed in him, but they wouldn't confess him for fear of the Jews. Even the rulers who believed wouldn't confess him for fear of the Jews. And so the issue here is Jesus wasn't committing additional truth to them yet. And this is a principle we find all through the New Testament, that to the one who has more will be given, and to the one who does not have, even what he has will be taken from him. And so the idea is if we want Jesus to continue to entrust more and more insight into his word to us, we must be responsive and apply what he does give us. And finally, notice the end of verse 24. It ends with, "He knew what was in man." Well, the beginning of chapter 3 and verse 1, and there's a bad chapter break here, is there was a man of the Pharisees named Nicodemus. Anthropos ends verse 25 and begins 3:1. Nicodemus is an example of what was wrong with these people. Nicodemus comes to Jesus by night, and he's mentioned 3 times in John. John 3, John 7, John 19. Each time it says he came to him at night. In fact, in my book, Confident in Christ, I call him Nick at Night, the original Nick at Night, because Nicodemus came to Jesus by night to hide that he was coming to learn from Jesus. And Nicodemus, even in John 7, is not ready to come out and say that he's a believer in Jesus. And even when he claims the body of Jesus with Joseph of Arimathea, he's not ready to come out and say that he's a believer. And in fact, Nicodemus is called a secret disciple of Christ in John 19, and so evidently, so is Nicodemus. And both Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus were members of the Sanhedrin, so they were examples of the John 12:43 truth. Many of the rulers believed in him, but were not confessing him for fear of the Jews. So basically, coming back to 2:23 to 25, the point is, there were people who came to faith in Jesus, were born again, believing in his name, as a result of the signs, perfectly fine. They were born again, but Jesus wasn't entrusting more truth to them because they were not yet willing, and he knew they were not yet willing to confess him. That's the whole point.